Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Althusser, The Detour of Theory by Gregory Elliot. Chapter 2 is titled A Recommencement of Dialectical Materialism. Quote, "We are absolutely committed to a theoretical destiny. We cannot read Marx's scientific discourse without at the same time writing at his dictation the text of another discourse, inseparable from the first one but distinct from it, the discourse of Marx's philosophy." End quote. Louis Althusser, Reading Capital. In Chapter 1, it was argued that Althusser considered a transformation of the Communist Party of France's political practice to be dependent upon a restoration of Marxist theory, more specifically a renewal of historical materialism, but this in turn had three theoretical preconditions. One, a critique of the dominant accounts of historical materialism, which supposedly departed from Marx, thereby vitiating development of his theory. Two, the displacement of these versions and their eventual replacement by the genuine article, in the event Althusser's own reconstruction. And three, the elaboration of the veritable Marxist philosophy, which could underwrite the scientificity of historical materialism and guide and guarantee the necessary extension of it. It should now be apparent why the final component of the Althusserian program was in fact for Althusser of paramount importance. Quote, "The investigation of Marx's philosophical thought was indispensable if we were to escape from ... the impasse in which history had put us." End quote. Althusser. What was needed was a philosophical, that is, quote, epistemological and historical, end quote, reading of Marx's work, which barred the route opened by Marx himself, pursued by Marxist intellectuals in reaction against the vulgarization and Stalinization of Marxism. The constitution of Marxist philosophy was a sine qua non of epistemological critique and scientific reconstruction. As Althusser put it in the book Reading Capital, quote, "The theoretical future of historical materialism depends on deepening dialectical materialism." End quote. Althusser. The hour of the missing Marxist, quote, dialectics, end quote, had arrived. Of course, Althusser was not the first to feel the need for an archaeological and methodological operation of this order. Marxist philosophers since Engels had attempted to remedy the absence of a, quote, logic. According to Althusser, however, complementary to the deformation of historical materialism after Marx was the proliferation of illegitimate versions of Marxist philosophy, for reasons that were both, quote, historico-political, end quote, and, quote, theoretical, end quote. The requisite historical epistemology had not materialized within Marxism. Instead, Marxist philosophy had taken the form of a succession of, quote, philosophical ideologies, end quote, which posited an illicit relationship between themselves and historical materialism. The dogmatist night, moreover, had not given way to the Marxist dawn. New section, a Stalinist de-Stalinization. The PCF had conducted its own inquiry into Stalinist philosophical dogmatism in June 1962. Presided over by Thérèse and presented by Garaudy, it was published under the title of The Tasks of Communist Philosophers and the Critique of Stalin's Errors in Cahiers du Communisme. I don't know if I would say that right. It's like the notebooks of communism. The, quote, theoretical and political review, end quote, of the Central Committee. In his report to the 20th Congress, Khrushchev, notwithstanding his concluded injunction, was silent on the subject of Marxist theory. Following the amplification of his critique of Stalin at the 22nd Congress, however, Soviet philosophers set to working on defining the, quote, tasks of Marxist-Leninist philosophy, end quote, on the, quote, road to communism, end quote. None other than Stalin's biographer, M.B. Mitten, editor-in-chief of Leprosy Philosophy and vice president of the Academy of Sciences, now criticized his former patron for schematism and underestimation of the Hegelian heritage. The abrogation of the, quote, negation of the negation, end quote, in particular, had been a serious mistake, Mitten argued in an article published in Recherche Internationale. At an assembly of French communist philosophers in January 1962, Waldeck Rocher, speaking on behalf of the Politburo, had defined Marxist philosophy as, quote, a scientific world outlook, end quote, and had ended his address by expressing confidence that, quote, philosopher members of the party will take account of the important lessons on the ideological level issuing from the 22nd Congress of the CPSU, which had deepened the work of the 20th Congress in all domains, end quote. Waldeck Rocher. Gaudi fell the lot later in the year of deducing the appropriate conclusions. Gaudi impunged Stalin's dialectical and historical materialism on three main counts. One, it had assimilated Marx's materialism to, quote, pre-Marxist dogmatic materialism, and quote, thus attenuating Marx's materialism's revolutionary novelty. Two, it had sundered the dialectic from contemporary science, thereby facilitating, quote, positivism and, quote, scientism. And three, it had amputated the, quote, philosophical heritage from dialectical materialism, therewith impoverishing the latter. Rectification of Stalin's original sin, quote, underestimation of the Hegelian legacy, end quote, consisted in a positive estimation of that heritage and restitution of the category of the negation of the negation. The root of Stalin's dogmatist, quote, errors, it was concluded, lay in his expunction of an integral, quote, source and component part, end quote, of Marxism from it. Unlike Bukharin or Trotsky, Hegel was to be officially rehabilitated. Gaudi's preliminary admonition against rejecting Stalin's heritage in block speaks volumes. Theoretical de-Stalinization in the Soviet and French Communist parties was effectively limited to, quote, disappearing, end quote, Stalin's writings. The theoretical bases of Stalinism were left largely untouched. Marxism-Leninism, a, quote, scientific world outlook, end quote, remained official doctrine. It had three components. 1. Marxist philosophy. 2. Marxist political economy. And 3. The theory of scientific communism. Marxist philosophy was dialectical materialism, the science of the laws of nature and thought. Applied to society, it became historical materialism, the science of the laws of social development. Two adjustments were made. The negation of the negation was restored to the corpus of dialectical materialism, the Asiatic mode of production to that of historical materialism. Althusser's article, Contradiction and Overdetermination, written at the same time as the PCF was holding its inquest, was an outright theoretical opposition to its findings, suggesting that priority be assigned to, quote, a rigorous conception of Marxist concepts and what distinguishes them once and for all from their phantoms, end quote. Althusser's judgment on Hegel was categorical, quote, one phantom is more especially crucial than any other today, the shade of Hegel. To drive this phantom back into the night, we need a little more light on Marx, or what is the same thing, a little more Marxist light on Hegel himself. We can then escape from the ambiguities and confusions of the, quote, inversion, end quote, end quote. Althusser. In the article on the materialist dialectic the following year, offered a full-scale alternative to Gaudi et al.'s conclusions. It was an ambitious attempt to clarify, inter alia, the Marx-Hegel relationship and to elaborate the Marxist philosophy which would superintend reconstruction of the Marxist architectonic. Althusser's sin, in other words, was to settle some of the accounts left open by Marx, incompletely settled by Engels and Lenin, and defaulted on by their successors. His viewpoint was diametrically opposed to the PCF's critique and rectification of Stalin's errors, something he had made clear by his reference to it in a note added in 1965. Quote, today it is official convention to reproach Stalin with having suppressed the, quote, laws of the dialectic, end quote, and more generally with having turned away from Hegel, the better to establish Stalin's dogmatism. At the same time, it is willingly proposed that a certain return to Hegel will be salutary. One day, perhaps, these declarations will become the object of some proof. In the meantime, it seems to me that it would be simpler to recognize that the expulsion of the, quote, negation of the negation from the domain of Marxist dialectic might be evidence of the real theoretical perspicacity of its author, end quote. Althusser. Insisting on the total discontinuity between Marx and Hegel, Althusser enjoined a, quote, return to this simple fact. In the only Marxist practices that have really been constituted, the categories in use or in action are not Hegelian. In action, the Marxist practice, there are different categories, the categories of the Marxist dialectic, end quote. Althusser. Contrary to Stalinist certitude, first among the unconstituted Marxist practices was Marxist philosophy. In two pressi of the books For Marx and Reading Capital, The articles Theory, Theoretical Practice, and Theoretical Formation, Ideology and Ideological Struggle of 1965, and the article Historical Materialism and Historical Materialism and Dialectical Materialism, 1966. Althusser surveyed the fate of Marxist philosophy since Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Marx was responsible for a, quote, double theoretical revolution, end quote. In the very act of founding the science of history, he had instituted, quote, another scientific discipline, end quote, Marxist philosophy. Yet he had only been able to lay the basis of it in polemical works such as the German Ideology, 1845-6, and the book The Poverty of Philosophy, 1846-7, in an unpublished, compressed methodological text, the 1857 introduction, and a few passages in Capital, particularly the 1873 postface to the second German edition of Volume 1. Engels' book Anti-Düring of 1878, and the book Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy of 1888 were also essential polemical interventions in the ideological struggle of the period. Lenin's Materialism and Empirio-Criticism of 1908, however, commendable a defense of science, was likewise the work of a, quote, partisan in philosophy, end quote. His unpublished philosophical notebooks of 1895 to 1916, marginal notes, still partially ideological, none of these Althusser maintained, displayed, quote, a degree of elaboration and systematicity, and hence scientificity, comparable to the degree of elaboration of historical materialism that we possess in Capital, end quote. What they did do, on the other hand, was indicate the object of Marxist philosophy was, quote, the history of the production of knowledges, or, the historical difference between ideology and science, or the specific difference of scientificity, end quote. In other words, in principle, dialectical materialism was, quote, a theory of the history of knowledge. A theory of the history of knowledge, that is, of the real conditions of the process of production of knowledge. Of the process of production of knowledge, end quote. Althusser. In principle, but not in practice. For what Althusser called the, quote, secular form of religion, end quote, dogmatism, had supervened to pronounce Marx's theory complete and prescribe unlicensed investigations and developments. The underdevelopment of Marxist philosophy by Marx, Engels, and Lenin on the one hand, and the ascendancy of Stalin on the other, meant that the project of a Marxist philosophy was unrealized. Indeed, it had not really progressed since the book Materialism and Empirio-Criticism. The discovery and rediscovery of Marx's early writings had issued in interpretations which, rather than making good the deficiency, had subverted the very project. With the Goridi report of 1962, the subversion had been made official. A return to Hegel was, theoretically, just as deleterious as the descent into a dogmatism no less dependent, beneath its, quote, materialist carapace, C-A-R-A-P-A-C-E, on Hegel. So 80 years after Marx's death and 120 years after the theses on Feuerbach, the question of Marxist philosophy was back on the agenda. It had never been off it. A new section. The Adventures of the Dialectic. Althusser alluded to, quote, historico-political and, quote, theoretical reasons for the, quote, remarkable history of Marxist philosophy from its origins to the present day, end quote, without undertaking a systematic analysis of them. Instead, he amalgamated very different philosophical systems into broad tendencies. Whilst he provided the outline of an explanation for the return to Hegel after the collapse of the Second International, Althusser was far less forthcoming on the career of Diamat. Despite pointing to the need for a Marxism of Marxism, Althusser signally failed to supply one. In order to comprehend the rationale for his own epistemology and situate it, a few basic landmarks in the history of Marxist philosophy must be recalled. The mandatory starting point is the systematization, indeed construction, of Marxism post-Marx, its dissemination within the Second International, and the far-reaching consequences of the form these took. It is important to remember that some of Marx's most important texts were not merely unpublished at his death, but remained so for decades thereafter. The book, The Critique of Hegel's Doctrine of the State, only published in 1927, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, only published in 1932, the German Ideology, published in 1932, and the Grundrisse, published between 1939 and 41. In the absence of these writings, leading figures in the Second International relied on two main sources for the conception of Marx's doctrine and the course of its constitution. First, Marx's 1859 preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy could be considered to provide both the official autobiographical account of Marx and Engels' development and a summary of the, quote, materialist conception of history, and, quote, to which it led. In addition, there were Marx's sporadic obiter dicta on his relationship to Hegel. Secondly, Engels' late works were available. Predictably, they were decisive for the younger generation on the character of Marxism. Anti-Düring, written while Marx was still alive and containing a chapter by him, was apprehended as the summa of the new, quote, world outlook, end quote. Ludwig Feuerbach is the definitive account of Marx and Engels' engagement with post-Kantian German philosophy. For Althusser, Engels' obligation to follow Düring wherever he went led him into the ideological Kampfplatz. For Engels, in contrast, quote, as a result, my negative criticism became positive. Polemic was transformed into a more or less connected exposition of the dialectical method and of the communist world outlook championed by Marx and myself, end quote. The first and longest part of Anti-Düring is entitled, quote, philosophy. The question of sui generis Marxist philosophy has always revolved around the problem of Marx's relation to Hegel. In his own reflection on the affinity between his dialectic and Hegel's in the 1873 postface, Marx encapsulated the difference between them via the metaphor of, quote, inversion. Distinguishing between two aspects of the dialectic, Marx referred to a process of inversion followed by extraction of the, quote, rational kernel from the, quote, mystical shell, whose felicitous result was that his own, quote, dialectical method was, quote, exactly opposite to Hegel's. Through this operation, the dialectic was transformed from an idealist construct, quote, transfiguring and glorifying what exists, end quote, into a materialist dialectic which was, quote, in its very essence critical and revolutionary, end quote. Marx. The concordance between this account and the mode of critique employed 30 years earlier in the critique of Hegel's doctrine of the state is evident, and was intimated by Marx. Derived from Feuerbach, it posits the need for a materialist reversal of Hegel's idealist inversion of subject and predicate, reality and thought. When, after Marx's death, Engels came to reconsider the German ideology in the book Ludwig Feuerbach, Engels too reverted to the intellectual framework of his youth. In a reprise of the young Hegelian's distinction between, quote, system and, quote, method, Engels sought to illuminate the German connection by locating a contradiction in Hegel's philosophy between an incipiently materialist, revolutionary dialectical method and an irredeemably idealist conservative system. This contradiction had been, quote, pulverized by Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, 1841, which had, quote, placed materialism on the throne again, end quote. The, quote, ideological perversion, end quote, of Hegel's idealism having been disposed of, quote, dialectics reduced itself to the science of the general laws of motion, both of the external and of the external world and of human thought, The dialectic of concepts itself became merely the conscious reflex of the dialectical motion of the real world, and thus the dialectic of Hegel was placed upon its head, or rather turned off its head, on which it was standing, and placed upon its feet, end quote. Marx and Engels. In the article, Contradiction and Overdetermination, Althusser queried the rigor of Marx's inversion metaphor and Engels' system/method dichotomy. In a direct challenge to virtually 90 years of Marxist philosophy, he argued that, correctly interpreted, Marx's postface did not license any Aufhebung of the Hegelian dialectic. Quote, In its approximation, this metaphorical expression, bracket, quote, inversion, and quote, and bracket, dot, 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 does pose the problem of the nature of the objects to which a single method should be applied, the world of the idea for Hegel, the real world for Marx, but rather the problem of the nature of the dialectic considered itself, that is, the problem of its specific structures, not the problem of the inversion of the, quote, sense of the dialectic, but that of the transformation of its structures, dot, dot, dot. If the Marxist dialectic is, quote, in principle, end quote, the opposite of the Hegelian dialectic, if it is rational and not mystical, mystified, mystificatory, this radical distinction must be manifest in its essence, that is, in its characteristic determinations and structures. Dot, dot, dot. This means that basic structures of the Hegelian dialectic, dot, 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 have for Marx, insofar as Marx takes them over, and he takes over by no means all of them, a structure different from the structure they have for Hegel. This means that basic structures of the Hegelian dialectic have for Marx, insofar as he takes them over, and he takes over by no means all of them, a structure different from the structure they have for Hegel, end quote. Althusser. And I believe that's overdetermination and contradiction. Contradiction and overdetermination. Quote, in principle perhaps, but not in actuality. For on the basis of his own interpretation, Engels appropriated Hegel's method and structures for Marxism. With Hegel, he avowed, philosophy came to an end in that, despite himself, Hegel, quote, showed us the way out of the labyrinth of systems to real positive knowledge of the world, end quote. Marx and Engels. Excuse me, Engels. Wait. Fuck. Engels, yeah. Engels thus remained an unwitting captive of the Hegelian system. In the ante-during, historical materialism was construed as a scientific, quote, political economy, end quote. Title of Part 2. And Marxist philosophy expanded into a scientific metaphilosophy. The universality of the laws of the dialectic, their uniform application to nature, human history, and thought, resolved the epistemological problem. In Engels', quote, reflection theory, epistemological correspondence was guaranteed by ontology. The, quote, general laws, end quote, of the dialectic were taken from Hegel's logic and held by Engels to be verified by contemporary scientific developments, most portentously Darwin's theory of evolution. There were three of them: the transformation of quantity into quality, the interpenetration of opposites, and the negation of the negation. Via an article written by Plekhanov in 1891 and endorsed by Engels to commemorate the 60th anniversary of Hegel's death, the use of the expression, quote, dialectical materialism, to designate this philosophical system passed into the currency of the Second and Third Internationals. That's very interesting. Simultaneously, in ontology and in epistemology, dialectical materialism was conceived by Engels as a scientific philosophy which, quote, summed up and was corroborated by the results of the natural sciences. In turn, it verified historical materialism, which it now subsumed. The supersession of Hegel's philosophical system, it consummated the break Marx and Engels had made in 1845-46, affecting an irrevocable parting of the ways with the German and all other ideologies. Thus it came about that the Second International could believe it had escaped the realm of, quote, philosophical rubbish, end quote, and attained the realm of science, precisely when its doctrine remained fatally dependent on a, quote, poor man's Hegelianism, end quote. Althusser. The German working class movement did indeed inherit classical German philosophy. On the credit of Engels' presentation, such teleological moments in Marx as Chapter 32 of Capital, Volume 1, the chapter, The Historical Tendency of Capitalist Accumulation and the Prestige of Such Doctrines in Their Own Cultures, Marxism was pressed by Kautsky and Plekhanov, doyens of their respective national Marxisms, into a positivist and evolutionist mold. In 1877, Marx had remonstrated with one of his critics, Mikhailovsky, for, quote, transforming my historical sketch of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historico-philosophical theory of the general path prescribed by fate to all nations, whatever the circumstances in which they find themselves, end quote, and go on to reject, quote, using as one's master key a general historico-philosophical theory, the supreme virtue of which consists in being super-historical, end quote. Marx. The problem was that the passe partout had been partially cut by the founders of Marxism. The crisis of Marxism provoked by the outbreak of World War I and the capitulation of the Second International stimulated a return to first principles on the left of the revolutionary movement. Even after the Russian Revolution, the Second International was regarded by Bolshevik leaders as having been a revolutionary organization until the eve of war. Its major theoreticians bona fide Marxists until their apostasy in August 1914. Lenin's own return to Hegel towards the end of 1914, recorded in his, quote, conspectus of the science of logic, issued in the revelation that it was, quote, impossible to comprehend Marx's Capital without mastering Hegel's logic. Quote, consequently, after half a century later, none of the Marxists have understood Marx, end quote. Lenin. Lenin's inference may be true, but it does not follow from his premises. For as we have seen, if the Second International could dispense with reading Hegel, as had Lenin in his anti-Hegelian what the quote book, what the friends of the quote friends of the people are, and how the quote friends of the people fight the Social Democrats of 1894, it was because it had let Engels do its reading for it. It's a very interesting statement. I'll read that again because I kind of fucked it up. For as we have seen, if the Second International could dispense with reading Hegel, as did Lenin in his anti-Hegelian What the Friends of the People Are and How They Fight the Social Democrats of 1894, the Second International could dispense with reading Hegel because the Second International had let Engels do the Second International's reading of Hegel for it. Lenin's attempt to read Hegel, quote, materialistically, by simply, quote, casting aside for the most part, God, the absolute, the pure idea, etc., end quote, started from the same postulate as Engels, that Hegel was, quote, materialism which had been stood on its head, end quote. I'm not sure. There's a couple of different quotes from in that piece that's in the same citation, so I think the first part quotes were from Lenin and the second were from Engels. Its outcome was similar to the initiatives of Engels and Plekhanov, quote, dialectical materialism. When Lenin thought he was breaking with Second International theoretical orthodoxy, Lenin was in fact miming it, on this issue at any rate. The, quote, logic of capital, which remedied the absence of a, quote, a Marxist, quote, logic, was, on Lenin's reading, decidedly more Hegelian than Althusser was prepared to admit. Footnote, as Lenin's statement of 1915 intimates, end footnote. For Althusser, Lenin alone had somehow avoided both the economism of the Second International and the Hegelianism that emerged after 1917 on the ultra-left of the Third. Althusser did not investigate the orthodoxy of the Second International in any depth, nor did Althusser explicitly indict Engels' contribution to it. Moreover, Althusser exempted Marx and Lenin from any responsibility for the, quote, disastrously opportunist interpretations of the Second International, end quote, Althusser. Instead, while noting that neither these nor, quote, Stalinist dogmatism, end quote, had, quote, as yet been buried by history, end quote, Althusser focused on the return to Hegel associated with Lukács, Korsch, and to a lesser extent Gramsci, the strategy whose reinvigoration post-Stalin was the main butt of his critique. Kalinikos has argued that, philosophically, Hegel was less significant for these figures than, quote, the anti-naturalist revolt at the turn of the 19th century, end quote. Alex Kalinikos, 1983. Nevertheless, as he and others have amply documented, an alternative conception of the Marx-Hegel filiation to that entertained by Kautsky and his colleagues was an important component in their undertaking. In a philosophical break with orthodoxy which they believed complementary to the Bolsheviks' political challenge, the protagonist of the Hegelian Marxist episode rebelled, as we have seen, against what Korsch called, quote, an anti-philosophical, scientifico-positivist conception of Marxism, end quote. Karl Korsch. In their contestation of it, they ratified their positivist adversaries' account and misrepresentation of science, seeking to deliver Marxism from its supposedly, quote, reified mode of understanding. In opposition to the objectivism and, quote, reflection theory, end quote, of the Engelsian heritage, they concurred in regarding Marxism as, quote, the theoretical expression of the revolutionary movement of the proletariat, end quote. According to this historicism, just as scientific socialism was the theoretical expression of a class subject, so the natural sciences were bourgeois ideology, bourgeois sciences which would be abolished together with the capitalist mode of production. Contrariwise, as the theoretical expression of the, quote, universal class of capitalist society, the proletariat, Marxism could attain to a genuine understanding of the social totality, which, according to these philosophies of praxis, was the creation and expression of humanity, of whose alienation and disalienation history was the unfolding drama. Thus, for Lukács, Marxism was the self-consciousness of the proletariat, itself the subject-object of history which would redeem all humanity in the act of emancipating itself. And, quote, orthodoxy, quote, referred exclusively to method, end quote. The dialectical method inherited from Hegel and now restricted, contra Engels, to, quote, the realms of history and society, end quote. A, quote, proletarian science, end quote. Historical materialism, quote, completed the program of Hegel's philosophy of history, even though at the cost of the destruction of his system, end quote. Lukács. Althusser recognized the, quote, real historical merits, end quote, of this current. Its idealism, relativism, and voluntarism had, he conceded, constituted a revolutionary protest against the fatalistic doctrine of the Second International. Its essential demerits, on the other hand, were twofold. It had, as it were, inverted the Second International's inversion of Hegel's philosophy of history, retaining its expressive totality, even if it substituted other principles for the dialectic between forces and relations of production. And consequent upon this, it had assimilated the sciences into the superstructure and placed them in an expressive relationship with class subjects. The upshot was that Marxism was converted into a proletarian science, less the knowledge of an object than the expression of a subject, and thereby denuded of substantive epistemological justification, being conceived as the self-consciousness of a historical moment and or its creator. In short, the return to Hegel was a, quote, revolution against capital, end quote, a fact confirmed by Lukács' valorization of Marx's early writings. Lukács and Korsch were rewarded for their labors with condemnation by Zinoviev for, quote, theoretical revisionism, end quote, at the Fifth Congress of the Comintern, and belabored in the Soviet Union by leading party philosopher Abram Deborin. The failure of revolution in the West was soon followed by its bureaucratization in the East. The philosophical controversy in the USSR between the, quote, dialecticians, Deborin et al., and the, quote, mechanist, Stepanov, Bukharin et al., was decided in 1929 in favor of the former, Deborin. The following year, however, quote, Bolshevization of Marx's philosophy, end quote, that is, the theoretical consecration of Stalin's new course, began in earnest. Mitten and Yudin made their debut to assail the, quote, Menshevizing idealism, end quote, of Deborin as the philosophical arm of Trotskyism, just as Deborin had indicted, quote, mechanical materialism, end quote, as the philosophical detachment of Bukharinism. On the 25th of January 1931, a resolution of the Central Committee condemned the Deborinites' journal, titled Under the Banner of Marxism.
Thereafter, Marxist theory in the USSR and the international communist movement was whatever Stalin or his functionaries decreed it to be. The adventures of the dialectic henceforth track the misadventures of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote. New section, the Cold War in Theory. In his 1961 foreword to Dialectical Materialism, Lefebvre recalled that just at the point when Marx's intellectual youth was being excavated, quote, the dogmatists were moving in the opposite direction, end quote. Lefebvre. What the contrivance and consolidation of theoretical Stalinism, the contrivance and consolidation of theoretical Stalinism, the ossification of dialectical materialism into a, quote, scientific philosophy of nature, end quote, Henri Lefebvre, involved a dogmatic dismissal of Hegel and the young Marx is undeniable. Stalin, quote, associate of Lenin and continuator of Marxism, end quote, repudiated the Hegelian heritage in Marxism. Stalin expelled the early works in the canon, the negation of the negation from the corpus. Lenin's philosophical notebooks, first published in 1929, fell under suspicion of taint of Hegelianism and were excluded from the fourth edition of the collected works. Coming from the, quote, scholar of genius, end quote, in the 1930s, such expediencies had the force of law. With Stalin's Dialectical and Historical Materialism of 1938, a section of the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks, theoretical Stalinism assumed its definitive form. The dialectic, supposedly, quote, in its very essence critical and revolutionary, end quote, was transformed into a state ideology, quote, transfiguring and glorifying what exists, end quote, the scientific verification of everything from Lysenko to Beria. Footnote, as Althusser would later argue in his 1977 B. Paradoxically, however, minus the negation of the negation, quote, Hegel, albeit the Hegelianism of Engels in the Second International was alive and well in Stalinist orthodoxy. Stalin had, as it were, rooted out the dragon seed of Hegelianism and Marxism-Leninism, only to secrete an even more banalized yet obstinate version of it at the heart of his own system. He had ejected the German ideology from Marx's genealogy in favor of Marxist Naturphilosophy, whose precursor was G.W.F. Hegel. The book, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, commenced with the reminder that, quote, Marx and Engels took from the Hegelian dialectic only its, quote, rational kernel, end quote, casting aside the Hegelian dialectic's idealistic shell, and developed the Hegelian dialectic further so as to lend the Hegelian dialectic rational kernel a modern scientific form, end quote. In accordance with Engels' late works, end quote, Stalin. In accordance with Engels' late works, including The Dialectics of Nature, published in 1925, Dialectical Materialism, the, quote, world outlook of the Marxist-Leninist Party, end quote, was construed as the general science of nature, history, and thought. Its, quote, dialectical method, end quote, was the prescribed Marxist-Leninist methodology for any and every subject. The, quote, Marxist realization of the positivist dream of the methodological unity of the nature and social sciences. The natural and social sciences. Historical materialism, bowdlerized into an evolutionism and economism, quote, histomat, end quote, was the, quote, application, end quote, of diamat to, quote, social life to the history of society, end quote. A natural science on the positivist model. This was what counted as Marxist philosophy and science for the whole communist movement during the Stalin period and beyond. In France, the translator of the short course, Georges Cogineau, described it as, quote, the compass of communism, end quote. Armed with its compass, the PCF negotiated the rapids of 1939, 1941, and 1947. In the latter year, the most virulent phase of what Georges Labica has called the, quote, reign of Diamat, end quote, commenced. That associated with the dictatorships of A.A. Zhdanov over Soviet culture and T.D. Lysenko over Soviet science. The, quote, two camps, end quote, that divided the world were politically were pronounced to exist in culture and science as well. Zhdanov's article on philosophy of 1947, recalling, quote, the party character of philosophy inherent in Marxism-Leninism, end quote, set the tone and style of the Cold War in theory. Soviet philosophers were excoriated for their complacency about, quote, for servility and fawning before bourgeois philosophy, end quote, and summoned to the class struggle on the, quote, philosophical front, end quote. Zhdanov. It was further made plain in this ex cathedra pronouncement that one subject was definitely not on the agenda, quote, the question of Hegel was settled long ago, end quote. Zhdanov. The following year, Lysenko and Lysenko's followers saw the triumph of their, quote, proletarian science, end quote, over the reactionary, quote, Mendelist Morganist, end quote. The, quote, Mendelist Morganists, end quote. The Communist Party of France loyally promoted both Lysenkoism and Zhdanovism. In an editorial in La Nouvelle Critique in 1950, de Santi argued that, as a, quote, social product, end quote, science was, quote, a historically relative ideology, end quote, and that, quote, taking a proletarian stance in science and adopting the criteria of proletarian science, end quote, were, quote, preconditions for objectivity in scientific debate, end quote. Quoted in Louvy, 1984. Science, stripped of any cognitive autonomy, became a site of class struggle. Francis Cohen, asserting the congruence of Lysenko's biology with the Scientia Scientiarum imparted by the, quote, greatest scientist of our time, end quote, parenthesis, Comrade Stalin, end parenthesis, reminded faint hearts, parenthesis, such as the distinguished biologist Marcel Prenant, end parenthesis, that, quote, there can no more be compromises in scientific matters than there can be compromises in the trade union struggle or in the struggle for peace. The struggle of the working class goes on in laboratories too, end quote. Quoted in Louvy. Loren Casanova donned Zhdanov's mantle, and in a speech of 1949 titled The Responsibilities of Communist Intellectuals, exhorted the Communist Party of France intellectuals to, quote, defend in all circumstances and with the utmost resolution all the positions of the party, end quote. Quoted in Caute, 1964, Caute. Cognio informed them that, quote, there is also a Marshall Plan of the mind, quote, there is also a Marshall Plan of the mind, end quote, and urged the protection of French culture from bourgeois cosmopolitanism. Ultimate proof of esprit de parti consisted in readiness to abjure real and imaginary deviations. Garaudy obliged for this overestimation of the French heritage in scientific socialism, Lefebvre for his of the Hegelian. This was the era evoked by Althusser in the introduction to his book For Marx. Quote, the war was just over. We were brutally cast into the party's great political and ideological battles. We had to measure up to our choice and take the consequences. In our political memory, this period remains the time of huge strikes and demonstrations, of the Stockholm Appeal and the peace movement. In our philosophical memory, it remains the period of intellectuals in arms, hunting out error from all its hiding places. Of the philosophers, we were, without writings of our own, but making politics out of all writing, and slicing up the world with a single blade, arts, literatures, philosophies, sciences, with the pitiless demarcation of class. The period summed up in caricature by a single phrase, a banner flapping in the void, quote, quote, bourgeois science, proletarian science, end quote. End quote. Althusser, for Marx. I think that introduction is actually on this channel. I haven't read the full book, but I read the introduction. Zhdanovism and Lysenkoism were the apotheosis of the philosophical, quote, subjectivism and, quote, voluntarism against which Althusser's own intervention was directed. That, quote, Stalinist dogmatism, end quote, was marked by such characteristics is a paradox noted not only by him. That this post-war, quote, theoretical leftism, end quote, reproduce certain aspects of the Hegelian leftism in the aftermath of the First World War has been remarked by Hobsbawm. That there remains the world of difference between their initiative and the Stalinist instrumentalization / politicization of theory in the interest of raison d'etat appears to have escaped Althusser, or at least was not registered by Althusser. Moreover, quote, paradoxically, it was none other than Stalin, whose contagious and implacable system of government and thought had induced this delirium, who reduced the madness to a little more reason. Reading between the lines of the few simple pages in which he proved the zeal of those who were making strenuous efforts to prove language a superstructure, we could see that there were limits to the use of the class criterion, and that we had been made to treat science, a status claimed by every page of Marx, as merely the first comer amongst ideologies. We had to retreat and in semi-disarray return to first principles. End quote. Althusser. As we shall see in Chapter 5, such an affidavit for Stalin's intervention against one of his own malign proletarian scientific creations, N.Y. Marr, in the book Marxism and Linguistics of 1950, is at best inappropriate. However, neither it nor Althusser's tribute to Stalin's, quote, theoretical perspicacity, end quote, regarding the negation of the negation should be taken as proof positive of Stalinism. Althusser was in agreement with Stalin over the Hegelian category, insofar as he identified it as the, quote, motor principle, end quote, of the Hegelian dialectic. Footnote. It should be noted that Althusser's anti-Hegelianism was based upon close acquaintance with the work both of Hegel and of the young Hegelians. In 1948, he had written a master's thesis titled On Content in the Thought of G.W.F. Hegel, under the supervision of Bachelard, and in 1960, as we have seen, edited and translated a selection of Feuerbach's writings, published in the prestigious Epimete series at Presse Universitaire de France, edited by Jean Hippolyte. Or Hippolyte, probably is how you actually say it. End footnote. Althusser was likewise in accord to the extent that Stalin had, albeit for reasons of his own, terminated the zenith of the Zhdanovist delirium. He was a decidedly dissentient, Althusser. Actually, I have no idea who this he is referring to. I don't know if it's Stalin or Althusser. Anyway, he was decidedly dissentient when it came to what Marxist philosophy should look like thereafter, employing Zhdanovism as the negative lens through which the rest of Marxist philosophy was to be viewed and categorized, the yardstick against which it was to be measured for its proximity to, quote, subjectivism. Althusser attempted a construction at its antipodes. New section. From capital, as in Marx's capital, to Marx's philosophy. Althusser's, quote, return to first principles, end quote, was not exactly that, since it started out from a distinction between historical and dialectical materialism, quote, affirmed by the Marxist tradition from Marx and Engels to Lenin and Stalin, end quote. Althusser. If Althusser denied that Marxist philosophy existed in theoretical form, Althusser asserted Marxist philosophy's presence in the, quote, practical state in Marx's capital. It was to be, quote, read, not in Engels, Lenin's, or Stalin's philosophical works, but in Marx.
the requisite epistemology for a scientific investigation of Marx's work happened to be Marx's own, the road it would be a difficult one. Fortunately, it was a ring road. The itinerary, as the title of Althusser's introductory paper in the book, Reading Capital, put it, would be, quote, from capital to Marx's philosophy, end quote. Quote, a philosophical reading of Marx's Capital is only possible as the application of that which is the very object of our investigation, Marx's philosophy. This circle is only epistemologically possible because of the existence of Marx's philosophy in the works of Marxism. It is therefore a question of producing ... something which in a sense already exists. End quote. Althusser. The quote circle, unquote, involved was further described in the introduction to the book For Marx. Quote, the precondition of a reading of Marx is a Marxist theory of the differential nature of theoretical formations and their history, that is, a theory of epistemological history, which is Marx's philosophy itself. ... This operation in itself constitutes an indispensable circle in which the application of Marxist theory to Marx himself appears to be the absolute precondition of an understanding of Marx, and at the same time is the precondition even of the constitution and development of Marx's philosophy. ... That Marxism can and must itself be the object of the epistemological question, that this question can only be asked as a function of the Marxist theoretical problematic, that is necessity itself for a theory which defines itself dialectically, not merely as a science of history, historical materialism, but also and simultaneously as a philosophy that is capable of accounting for the nature of theoretical formations and their history, and therefore capable of accounting for itself by taking itself as its own object. Marxism is the only philosophy that theoretically faces up to this test. End quote. Althusser. For Marx. Wait, no. Yeah, for Marx. Granted for the time being that Marx's epistemology is at work, imminent in Capital, the book, and so on, and granted that Althusser's intention is to extract and systematize it, that it might be known to Marx's philosophy, might be known to be. Let me read that again. Granted for the time being that Marx's epistemology is at work, imminent in the book Capital, and so on, and granted that Althusser's intention is to extract and systematize Marx's epistemology, that it might be known to be Marx's philosophy, an apparently insuperable barrier remains. If Althusser must construct the appropriate epistemology with which to make and justify discriminations within Marx's work, he must first of all supply the reading protocols which can facilitate its extraction and prove that it is both the sui generis Marxist philosophy and Marx's. Otherwise, he would be vulnerable to the same accusations of infidelity he leveled at his colleagues. This is, of course, a brackety powerful objection to Althusser's whole strategy, namely that there is something inherently dogmatic and viciously circular in employing Marx's philosophy to guarantee the status of Marx's science. Althusser circumvents this objection and the preceding problem by having it both ways and playing both ends against his middle. On the one hand, by appealing to Marx's 1857 introduction as the rough draft of the Marxist, quote, discourse on method, end quote, Althusser seeks to placate potential Marxist critics. On the other hand, by drawing on the prestigious Bachelardian tradition, Althusser aims to preempt the Marxist and non-Marxist accusation of dogmatism. The appropriation of Bachelardian theses allows Althusser to get his excursion underway. En route, Althusser evidently believed the scientificity of his version of dialectical materialism, pronounced to accord with Marx's own methodological reflections, would be demonstrated. Althusser's aim was not simply to plug a gap in the canon of Marxism, but to erect a scientific philosophy which respected the scientificity of the natural sciences and which, in turn, demanded recognition of the scientific status of historical materialism, in order to justify his proposal for a sui generis Marxist philosophy. Althusser invoked historical precedent, maintaining that philosophical revolutions were attendant upon, quote, induced by, scientific revolutions. Thus, just as Greek mathematicians had given rise to Platonic and Galilean physics to Cartesian philosophy, so historical had, quote, induced dialectical materialism. Its advent post festum conformed to the pattern set by its predecessors. Involved in all of them was the quote, the quote, reprise, end quote, of a basic scientific discovery and philosophical reflection, and the production by philosophy of a new form of rationality. End quote. Althusser. Marxist philosophy was, however, primus inter pares. The novelty of dialectical materialism was that with its arrival, philosophy had passed from, quote, the condition of an ideology to a scientific discipline, end quote, one capable of rendering a scientific account of its object, the history of the production of knowledge. By virtue of his, quote, double theoretical revolution, end quote, Marx occupied a, quote, exceptional position in the history of human knowledge, end quote. Althusser. As a scientific philosophy, dialectical materialism could function as a, quote, guide, not only for the science of history, imperiled as it was by Garaudiism, I guess that's Garaudi, like Roger Garaudiism, and so on, but if needs be, for all the other sciences, natural and social alike as well. On this basis, Althusser criticized a common tendency in the history of Marxism, quote, the negation of philosophy, end quote. The recurrent temptation of the, quote, end of philosophy, end quote, had taken three major forms. One, a, quote, ethical form, inspired by Marx's early writings, in which philosophy, abstract discourse of the truth, would disappear upon its concrete, quote, realization. Two, a, quote, historicist form, in which philosophy passes away with the transient historical moment, of which it is the transitory, quote, expression. And three, a, quote, positive form, nourished by the German ideology in Ludwig Feuerbach, in which speculative philosophy cedes to empirical science. Against these was to be set the properly Marxist conception of philosophy. Marxist philosophy was not, as Sartre supposed, quote, the philosophy of our time, end quote, unsurpassable, like its bourgeois antecedents, until, quote, man is gone beyond the historical moment which they express, end quote. Sartre. It was a scientific discipline with its own object, theory, and method, destined to outlive the moment of Marxist philosophy's birth, and autonomous of any historical consciousness. What is the cogency of Althusser's, quote, indispensable circle, end quote? According to Althusser, Marxist philosophy existed de jure and was active de facto. Marxist philosophy's practical content now had to be given theoretical form. In other words, it remained to be constituted. For an anti-Althusserian, however, why this philosophy remained to be constituted remains to be explained. If Althusser's schema is right, why is not the dialectical materialism of Engels, Lenin, or Stalin the, quote, induced philosophy? Why is it Althusser who, although he makes no such claims, must play the role of Descartes to Marx's Galileo? But is Althusser's schema right? Did Marx's new theory of history necessarily provoke a philosophical revolution? Was it a, quote, double theoretical revolution, end quote? Or is Althusser's contentious initiative seeking in an unsubstantiated analogy with the history of philosophy, and in the unveiling labors of Engels and others, its own justification, the product of, and as he hoped, the deliverance from, a, quote, theoretical impasse, end quote, closer to home? This last question can be answered in the affirmative. Althusser needed Marxist philosophy for his own purposes, as was made abundantly clear in the book Reading Capital. Quote, in order to understand Marx, we must treat him as one scientist among others, and apply Marx's scientific work to Marx's scientific work the same epistemological and historical concepts we would apply to others. Marx thus appears as the founder of a science comparable with Galileo or Lavoisier. An understanding of Marx leads us to the concepts of a general theory of the history of the sciences. It is one thing whether this general theory as yet only exists as a project or whether it was already partially materialized. It is another that is absolutely indispensable to a study of Marx. It is absolutely indispensable to a study of Marx. The path Engels designates for us, is a path we must take at all costs. It is none other than the path of the philosophy founded by Marx in the act of founding the science of history. End quote. Althusser. If Althusser's justification of why the philosophy remained to be constituted is, in intra-Marxist terms, exiguous, his conception of how it was to be constructed is controversial in the extreme, raising once again the question of the models, non-Marxist and Marxist, from which it departed. New section, the theory of theoretical practice. The presentation of the Theorie series, I guess it's a book series, defined the Althusserian project in philosophy. Marx's philosophy was to be a, quote, theory of the production of knowledges, end quote, a theory which broke with all forms of idealism. Marx's philosophy comprised 1. A theory of scientific and ideological discourse, theoretical practice, and what distinguished this practice from other practices. 2. A theory of the history of sciences as distinct from other forms of history. And 3. A theory of the structure and history of the other. Non-theoretical, socialist practices with which theoretical practice is, quote, articulated. Quote, contained in Marx's writings, this project coincided with the Bachelardian research program. In the event, the philosophy Althusser supposedly wrote at Marx's dictation had non-Marxist dictators as well, and hence, to change the metaphor, was more of an improvisation than a recitation. First, there was the work of Bachelard. Contemporary with the nadir of theoretical Stalinism in the USSR and the international communist movement was the publication of Bachelard's second trio of major works, the first being in 1949, Le Rationalisme Appliqué. I don't know if that means applied rationalism. I'm not sure. That's my guess. And then in 1951, a book called L'activité rationaliste de la physique contemporaine. I guess is that the rationalist activity of contemporary physics? I have no idea. And in 1953, Le Materialisme rationnel, which I'm supposing is rational materialism. I'm guessing, though. Before all else, perhaps, Bachelard was himself one of the, quote, Anabaptist philosophers, end quote, he summoned to the defense of the contemporary natural sciences in 1951, a partisan of scientific knowledge and, quote, polemicist against its detractors. Bachelard's ambition throughout his career was to construct, quote, a philosophy, genuinely adequate to constantly evolving scientific thought, end quote. Bachelard. This involved Bachelard in continual confrontation with other epistemologies and philosophies, empiricism, realism, phenomenology, and so on. Briefly put, Bachelard argued that there was a total disjunction between scientific knowledge and what he termed connaissance commune. For Bachelard, the latter is aconceptual, but imbued with unconscious, quote, epistemological obstacles, impediments to the development of scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge, in contrast, is irreducibly conceptual, initiated by a, quote, epistemological break, end quote, which separates scientific knowledge from common sense. An index of the difference between the scientific and non-scientific is to be found in the difference between their respective objects, whereas the object of common sense knowledge is, quote, given by everyday experience. The object of science is, quote, constructed by/in its conceptual system. The concept of rupture, epistemologique, signifies the discontinuity between episteme and doxa in general, and discontinuities in the history of already established sciences in particular. Given that the latter continues to exhibit epistemological discontinuities, an adequate epistemology could only be a historical epistemology, focusing on the process of transformation of concepts. The history of the sciences was conceived as being, quote, guided by a kind of autonomous necessity, end quote. The progressive emergence, discontinuous but continual, of, quote, rational values, end quote, which devalued and demarcated themselves from the non-scientific. As Peter Dews has noted, if Bachelard assigns theory primacy over experience and considers scientific progress to reside in increasing conceptual coherence and progressive mathematization, he does not adopt a purely rationalist position. Rectification of a theory on the basis of new evidence is envisaged. The second ancestor of Althusser's epistemology, on the other hand, adopted precisely such a position. One second. In Reading Capital, Spinoza was credited with having been, quote, the first man in the world to have proposed both a theory of history and a philosophy of the opacity of the immediate, end quote, Althusser. The latter, as Althusser concedes, is no novelty of Spinoza's or Bachelard's. Quote, an object cannot be defined by its immediate visible or sensuous appearance. It is necessary to make a detour via its concept in order to grasp it, ... These theses have a familiar ring to them. At least they are the lesson of the whole history of modern science, more or less reflected in classical philosophy, even if this reflection took place in the element of empiricism, ... end quote. Althusser and Balibar, or Althusser in Althusser and Balibar, Reading Capital. Spinoza's revolutionary singularity in the classical philosophical tradition consists in the fact that Spinoza had contrived to avoid the myriad lures of, quote, empiricism. Spinoza had made a categorical distinction between the, quote, true idea, such as the idea of a circle, and its, quote, ideate, the circle, a distinction mapped by Althusser onto the 1857 introduction and rendered as the irreducible difference between the theoretical object, the quote, object of knowledge, and the, quote, real object. Moreover, Spinoza had distinguished between, quote, three kinds of knowledge, end quote. The first, quote, opinion or imagination, end quote, whose source is random sense experience, experientia vaga, was said to be, quote, the only source of falsity, end quote. The other two, quote, reason and, quote, intuition, supposedly yielded knowledge which was, quote, necessarily true. What Althusser called Spinoza's, quote, theory of difference between the imaginary and the true, end quote, was employed by him to think the Marxist opposition between science and ideology. Quote, truth is the standard both of itself and of falsity, end quote, wrote the author of the Ethics, an axiom upon which Althusser was later to confess his reliance. Scientific knowledge, that is, the system of adequate ideas that are the concepts of their objects, is a criterion not only of itself, but of the non-scientific or ideological, or inadequate ideas as well. Thus Spinoza rejected the traditional, quote, correspondence, and, quote, conception of knowledge, bracket, adequatio rai et intellectus, bracket, adequatio rai e intellectus, I don't fucking know, end bracket. I'll try one more time. Adequatio re intellectus. That's my best guess. Could be intellectu, but I'm not sure. Reversing this definition, he held that true ideas were not adequate to their objects because of their extrinsic correspondence to them. On the contrary, they corresponded to their objects because of their intrinsic adequacy. Conjugating Spinoza and Marx, Althusser opted for the Dutchman's epistemological rationalism over the German scientific realism. In the article, Theory, Theoretical Practice, and Jesus Christ. In the article, Theory, Theoretical Practice, and Theoretical Formation, Althusser warned of the dangers of apprehending Marxist science in empiricist or dogmatist fashion. In the latter case, it was treated as a, quote, absolute, finished knowledge which poses no problem of development or research, end quote. In the former as the, quote, direct, quote, natural reflection of the real, fruit of Marx's unclouded vision. Quote, the idea we have of science, end quote, Althusser wrote, quote, is decisive for Marxist science itself, end quote. Althusser. The first principle of a correct idea of science was the Spinoza-Bachelardian one that, quote, far from reflecting the immediate givens of everyday experience and practice, bracket, a science, and bracket, is constituted only on the condition of calling them into question and breaking with them, end quote. Althusser. Scientific knowledge can be obtained only through a detour via the concept of an object, but before that the concept must be produced. In the book, On the Improvement of the Understanding, a, quote, discourse against method, end quote, Spinoza had rejected the Cartesian search for a priori guarantees of the possibility of knowledge as both unavailing, for condemned to an infinite regress, and unnecessary, for, quote, we have a true idea, end quote, habemus enim ideam verum. Questions about the validity of knowledge must commence from the prior recognition of its facticity. And it was the possession of knowledge criterion of itself and its other, which permitted the provision of further knowledge, a process illustrated by analogy with the, quote, making of tools, end quote. Indeed, the knowledge process could be viewed as a process of production of, quote, intellectual instruments, end quote. Developing this conception of knowledge as production and associating Marx with it, Althusser argued that the production of knowledge of real objects by the production of their adequate concepts was the result of a specific practice, theoretical practice. Althusser's first move was to insist that theory was not the abstract spiritual obverse of concrete material practice, but itself exactly such a practice. Strictly speaking, there was no such thing as, quote, practice in general, only, quote, distinct practices, end quote. To deny the specificity of theoretical practice was to nullify, quote, the reality of scientific practice, end quote. Althusser. The effects of this traditional and deep-rooted denegation were not restricted to an inadequate comprehension of science in general. The theory-practice dichotomy could be brandished to embarrass Marxist intellectuals over their sojourn au-dessus de la mêlée in a conceptual limbo. Whether done out of benign or malignant motives, this underestimated the crucial role apportioned theory, scientific knowledge by Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and played by it in revolutionary politics. After the depredations of Zhdanovism, theory had to secure recognition of its justified claims to relative autonomy, precisely in order to fulfill its proper function as a, quote, guide for practice. Drawing on Marx's analysis of the labor process and capital, Althusser dissected, quote, society into four main practices: economic, political, ideological, and theoretical, the ensemble of which constitutes the, quote, complex unity of, quote, social practice, end quote, end quote. Each practice was said to have three, quote, moments: raw material, means of production, and product. Quote, by practice in general, I shall mean any process of transformation of a determinate given raw material into a determinate product, a transformation effected by a determinate human labor, using a determinate means of, quote, production, end quote. In any practice thus conceived, the determinate moment or element is neither the raw material nor the product, but the practice in the narrow sense, the moment of the labor of transformation itself, which sets to work in a specific structure, means, and a technical method of utilizing the means, end quote. Althusser proceeds to sketch outlines of economic, political, and ideological practice, definitions to which we shall return in Chapter 3. Offering these as, quote, essential preliminary hypotheses, end quote, he made no attempt to substantiate the case for his a priori characterization of the contents of the social. Instead, he turned to a discussion of theoretical practice, defining it as follows, quote, by theory, I shall mean a specific form of practice, itself belonging to the complex unity of the, quote, social practice of a determinate human society. Theoretical practice falls within the general definition of practice. It works on a raw material, representations, concepts, facts, which it is given by other practices, whether, quote, empirical, quote, technical, or, quote, ideological. In its most general form, theoretical practice does not include scientific theoretical practice, but also pre-scientific theoretical practice, that is, quote, ideological theoretical practice, end quote. Althusser. Theoretical production, it was argued, shares the structure of other practices. Its raw material, labeled, quote, generality 1, is itself theoretical, composed of, quote, representations, concepts, facts, end quote, whether scientific or not. Its means of production, labeled, quote, generality 2, is its, quote, problematic, end quote. The theoretical matrix in which the concepts of a discourse are ordered / unified, and on the basis of which questions are asked and answered, problems posed and resolved or not. Its products, quote, generalities 3, are knowledges. The determinate moment of theoretical practice is the second, namely the, quote, labor of transformation, end quote. Quote, theoretical practice produces generalities 3 by the work of generality 2 on generality 1, end quote. Althusser. An adequate account of this practice involved analysis not only of its labor process, but of its social relations of production as well. In other words, consideration, specification of its relations with the wider social structure, quote, thought is the historically constituted system of an apparatus of thought, founded on and articulated to natural and social reality, is defined by the system of real conditions which make it, a determinate mode of production, of knowledges. As such, it is constituted by a structure which combines, the type of object, raw material in which it labors, the theoretical means of production available, its theory, its method, and its technique, experimental or otherwise, and the historical relations, both theoretical, ideological, and social, in which it produces, end quote. Althusser. Cognitively autonomous, socially, theory is relatively autonomous. The prime enemy of this epistemology, the theory of theoretical practice, was dubbed, quote, the empiricist conception of knowledge, end quote. As portrayed by Althusser, the empiricist conception of knowledge embraced much more than, perhaps even the opposite of empiricism as normally understood. To this paradigm, Althusser assimilated any theory of the cognitive process, which represented the cognitive process as the confrontation between knowing subject and object to be known, and which conceived knowledge as abstraction by the subject of the essence of the object. According to Althusser, this conception was the, quote, secular transcription, and, quote, of a, quote, religious myth of reading. A, quote, religious myth of reading, end quote. Althusser. Knowledge was not vision, but production. Knowledge was not vision, but production. Not abstraction or purification, but appropriation. Not abstraction or purification, but appropriation. The putative Marxist authority for Althusser's representation of the cognitive process as a productive one, wholly internal to thought, was Marx's 1857 Introduction. It was the text that, quote, allows us to distinguish Marxist philosophy from every speculative or empiricist philosophy, end quote. For in it, the, quote, order of thought, end quote, and the, quote, order of the real, end quote, were unequivocally differentiated. Marx had proposed two, quote, materialist theses, quote, the primacy of the real over thought about the real, end quote, and, quote, the specificity of thought and of the thought process, end quote. Thus the, quote, real object, end quote, parenthesis, Spinoza's circle, or the cat which can meow, in parenthesis, is neither directly involved in nor affected by the process of theoretical production. The starting point, raw material, and end result, product of that practice is the, quote, object of knowledge. Spinoza's idea of the circle / the concept of cat which cannot meow, via which theoretical object knowledge of the real object is, quote, appropriated. The novelty and superiority of Althusser's epistemology, or so he believed, consisted in its acceptance, contrary to all forms of empiricism, which provoked the perennial, quote, problem of knowledge, end quote, that knowledge was an intra-theoretical process of production, without ceasing to be objective knowledge. Knowledge, the, quote, concrete in thought, end quote, whilst utterly distinct from the real, the, quote, real concrete, end quote, was knowing of a reality itself, wholly independent of thought or discourse. In principle, Althusser's epistemology was simultaneously, quote, anti-empiricist and, quote, materialist. To the distinction between theoretical practice on the one hand and economic, political, and ideological practice on the other was added a distinction internal to theoretical practice. In accordance with the classical Marxist opposition between science and ideology, Althusser distinguished between scientific theoretical practice and pre-scientific or ideological theoretical practice. Some theoretical practices are scientific, that is, produce scientific knowledge, while others, the majority, are ideological, that is, produce knowledge, quote, produce ideological, quote, knowledge. Althusser categorized the latter as, quote, the forms of, quote, knowledge that make up the prehistory of a science and their, quote, philosophies, end quote, end quote. Althusser. To theorize the distinction between knowledge and, quote, knowledge, Althusser adopted two Bachelardian concepts, epistemological break and problematic. Following Bachelard, Althusser posited a, quote, qualitative, end quote, theoretical and historical discontinuity, end quote, between science and theoretical ideology. Since the discontinuity arises at a particular moment in theoretical history, it can only be located by an epistemological historical, an epistemologically informed genealogy of science. The index of scientificity in the Althusserian, as in the Bachelardian scheme of things, is a, quote, rupture between the scientific and the non-scientific within a particular theoretical region. This, quote, break, a discourse crosses the threshold of scientificity and it gains cognitive autonomy. Thereafter, the theoretical practice of a science is its own criterion. Its products require no prior guarantees or external confirmation. Verification is internal to the theory. As for Spinoza, truth is its own standard. In genuine sciences, including historical materialism, there is a, quote, radical inwardness of the criterion of practice, end quote. Quote, to speak of the criterion of practice where theory is concerned, receives its full sense. For theoretical practice is indeed its own criterion, and contains in itself definite protocols with which to validate the quality of its product, i.e., the criteria of the scientificity of the products of scientific practice. This is exactly what happens in the real practice of the sciences. Once they are truly constituted and developed, they have no need for verification from external practices to declare the knowledges they produce to be, quote, true, i.e., to be knowledges, dot, dot, dot. We should say the same of the science which concerns us most particularly, historical materialism. It has been possible to apply Marx's theory with success because it is, quote, true, end quote. It is not true because it has been applied with success, end quote. Althusser, Reading Capital. Sparing the intrusions of the extra-theoretical in the shape of Cardinal Bellarmine or Comrade Zhdanov, scientific theoretical practice serves neither God nor Mammon. Ideological practice, in contrast, is, quote, governed by, quote, interest, end quote, beyond the necessity of knowledge alone, end quote. Althusser. Following Spinoza, Althusser conceived theoretical ideology as a, quote, kind of knowledge, but as an inferior species, one that, quote, designates dot 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 existence, but dot 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 does not give us their essences, end quote. Althusser, quote, source of falsity, end quote. It was not falsity per se. Althusser defined ideology in general as an omnihistorical phenomenon. Quote, the, quote, lived relation between men and the world, end quote. Althusser. As a representation of this, quote, imaginary relation, ideology is not mere error or illusion. It is an objective reality, a material practice whose theoretical relays can be confuted, but which cannot itself be dissipated by science. Theoretical ideology is a knowledge, but in the form of recognition, not cognition. This is so because it is governed by adventitious factors extraneous to science, what Althusser calls the, quote, practico-social functioning, quote, as opposed to the, quote, theoretical functioning, quote. Quote, in the theoretical model of production of ideology, dot, 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 the formulation of a problem is merely the theoretical expression of the conditions which allow a solution already produced outside the process of knowledge, because imposed by extra-theoretical instances and exigencies, dot, 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 to recognize itself in an artificial problem, manufactured to serve it, both as a theoretical mirror and as a practical justification, end quote. Althusser. The result, in the words of Alain Badiou, is that whereas, quote, science is a process of transformation, ideology, dot, 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 is a process of repetition, end quote. Alain Badiou. The, quote, qualitative leap, end quote, or mutations marking the difference between a science and a theoretical ideology, was situated by Althusser in the Discourses Problematic. Although rarely employed by Bachelard, this concept was implicit in his work. Quote, the sense of the problem is characteristic of the scientific mind, end quote. Althusser wrote in... This is Bachelard. Quote, the sense of the problem is characteristic of the scientific mind, end quote. Bachelard wrote in the book La Formation de l'Esprit Scientifique, in a passage which anticipated Althusser's thesis on the modality of the formulation of problems in theoretical ideology. As adapted by Althusser, the concept denoted, quote, the typical systematic structure, the typical systematic structure, unifying all the elements of the thought, end quote, and referred to a, quote, fact peculiar to the very existence of science, end quote. Quote, it can only pose problems on the terrain and within the horizons of a definite theoretical structure. It's problematic, which constitutes its absolute and definite condition of possibility, and hence the absolute determination of the forms in which all problems must be posed. And hence the absolute determination of the forms in which all problems must be posed at any given moment in the science. End quote. Althusser. A non-scientific problematic is characterized by its closure, its repetitive revolution in an ideological circle. A scientific problematic by the scientific problematic's openness to pertinent problems and those pertinent problems' rigorous solution. A scientific problematic's capacity for self-rectification and development. Because a problematic is both present and absent, in Althusser's structuralist terminology, quote, diachronic and, quote, synchronic, quote, in any particular segment of theoretical discourse, a special kind of reading is required in order to reconstruct it. The, quote, symptomatic reading, end quote, which, like the Freudian analyst technique, proceeds from the surface discourse to its latent system, or, quote, unconscious, end quote. At stake is more than, quote, openness and closure in general, end quote. For any adequate epistemology must concern itself with, quote, the typical historically determined structures of this openness and closure. With, quote, the typical historically determined structures of this openness and closure. Specific ruptures and transitions can be identified only by working from within the problematic of the already constituted science, since the general concept of the break between the scientific and the ideological tout court cannot specify the conditions of a particular break. For example, Marx's with classical political economy. The problematic with which a science breaks at the moment of its constitution, its, quote, point of no return, or its, quote, recasting, is a necessary but insufficient condition of the new problematic. In the case of historical materialism, for example, there would have been no such theory, but for what preceded it. It was not created ex nihilo by Marx. At the same time, however, it was not vouchsafed by the synthesis of pre-existing discourses / problematics, German philosophy, English political economy, French utopian socialism. The pre-scientific problematic forms part of the real history, the prehistory of the science. Although a science is inaugurated, quote, by detaching science from the ideology of its past, and by revealing this past as ideological, end quote, and although after its constitution the science amounts, Spinoza style, to a, quote, science of the ideology, end quote, the science ideology distinction must not be treated in Enlightenment fashion as the rationalist partition between truth and error, but historically. The strange, quote, gods of origins and goals, end quote, are to be disposed in favor of the, quote, necessity of contingency, end quote. Althusser. Qua historical epistemology, the theory of theoretical practice, the, quote, theory of science and of the history of science, end quote, join with the Bachelardians in opening the path to, quote, a revolution in the traditional concept of the history of the sciences. We are beginning to conceive this history as a history punctuated by radical discontinuities, profound reorganizations which, if they respect the continuity of the existence of regions of knowledge, and even this is not always the case, nevertheless inaugurate with their rupture the reign of a new logic, which, far from being a mere development of the old one, literally takes its place. End quote. Footnote. Althusser cites the work of Bachelard, Cavaille, Canguilhem, Foucault, and Alexandre Claret as, quote, remarkable exceptions to the dominant teleological and continuist historiography. End footnote. As Althusser was well aware, Althusser's negative demarcation of theoretical ideology from science is not a positive specification of the scientificity of science. This, in conjunction with his insistence on the autonomy of theory, prompts the traditional epistemological question. In Althusser's case and terms, it takes the following form. How do we know that the result or products of scientific theoretical practices are knowledges? Althusser straightaway rejects the problematic of the, quote, theory of knowledge derived from the, quote, closed circle of classical philosophy, reproving its variants as variations on a juridical practice of philosophy which, quote, makes laws for the sciences in the name of a right it arrogates to itself, end quote. Althusser. The search for de jure or de facto guarantees must be renounced as impermissible, ideological. Where the hell am I? Sorry. In search for de jure de facto guarantees must be renounced as impermissible. An impermissible ideological project leading at best to an infinite regress. In the Althusserian quote, theory of the history of the production of knowledges, end quote, it is accepted that the theoretical object of a theoretical practice is the, quote, appropriation of the real object, the real world, end quote. But is it? As has been noted, the motivation of Althusser's project was the definition and defense of the scientificity of historical materialism. The distinctiveness of Althusser's approach to the issue lay in his effort to erase any epistemological distinction between Marx's theory of history and the natural sciences, without lapsing into a discreditable positivism. Marxism was a science, quote, among others, end quote, at once autonomous and scientific. Althusser was fundamentally at variance with the existing Marxist tradition in spurning both the, quote, correspondence theory of truth of classical Marxism and the pragmatist conception of truth of Stalinism, and replacing them by the self-sufficiency of the modes of proof of the established sciences. The inadequacy and circularity of such a criterion for the contemporary natural sciences is one thing. Few would challenge their scientific status. With historical materialism, things stand rather differently, as a roll call of Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, and Imre Lakatos is sufficient to remind us. Without positive, compelling criteria of scientificity, Althusser's bid for historical materialism is imperiled, and the theory of theoretical practice, considered by him, quote, the theory, of what constitutes the scientificity of the sciences, end quote, itself founders as a scientific satisfactory account of science. Althusser did have an answer to the epistemological problem, or rather a question. In the article on the materialist dialectic, the pertinent response to the, quote, problem of knowledge, end quote, had been its dissolution. The, quote, non-problematicity of the relation between an object and the knowledge of it, end quote, was straightforwardly asserted. The ingenuousness of this, quote, solution presumably being apparent in the book Reading Capital, Althusser took another tack. For epistemological guarantees, the theory of theoretical practice substituted the question of the, quote, mechanism of the cognitive appropriation of the real. Therewith, Althusser believed, philosophy made the transition from ideology to scientificity. The key question became, quote, by what mechanism does the process of knowledge, which takes place entirely in thought, produce the cognitive appropriation of its real object, which exists outside thought in the real world? Or again, by what mechanism does the production of the object of knowledge produce the cognitive appropriation of the real object, which exists outside thought in the real world? And a lot of that was in italics, so I'm going to read it all again. Quote, by what mechanism does the process of knowledge, which takes place entirely in thought, produce the cognitive appropriation of its real object, which exist outside thought in the real world? Or again, by what mechanism does the production of the object of knowledge produce the cognitive appropriation of the real object, which exists outside thought in the real world? End quote. Althusser in Reading Capital. Notoriously, this question received no real answer, and aporia all the more obvious for the lucidity of Althusser's posing of it. The, quote, knowledge effect, end quote, which is, quote, the peculiarity of those special products which are knowledges, end quote, remains unilluminated beyond cryptic and in any case circular allusions to the significance of the internal organization and disposition of concepts, the, quote, systematicity of the system, end quote. The, quote, systematicity of the system, end quote. Since it pertains to science and ideological theoretical practice alike, however, its elucidation would not answer our question. The reader may know how Part 1 of Reading Capital ends. A subject, the knowledge mechanism, 10 pages of intricate questions, then silence. If, as Althusser maintained, there are no innocent readings, by the same token, there are guilty silences. Arguably, Althusser's was one, for there is a solution to the problem of the correspondence between thought and the real in his work, only it is unavowed as such. To make it explicit is to reveal the contradictory character of Althusser's philosophical project. According to the standard Soviet account of dialectical materialism, it is, quote, the science of the more general laws governing the development of nature, society, and thought, end quote. Quote, the science of the more general laws governing the development of nature, society, and thought, end quote. Althusser. Of which historical materialism is a subset. Quote, a philosophical science concerned with the specific laws of social development as distinct from the universal laws of being. Quote, a philosophical science concerned with the specific laws of social development as distinct from the universal laws of being, end quote. It is worth noting here that the footnote. It is worth noting here that the only commentator, to my knowledge, to have undertaken a systematic comparison between Althusserian and Orthodox Soviet conceptions of Marxism concludes, quote, the differences between the Soviets and the Althusserians, involve basic disagreements concerning principles. From the Soviet perspective, Althusser and his followers seek to shed vast areas of Marxism, end quote. Nemeth, 1980, or Nemeth, 1980. Mutatis mutandis, it can be said that these definitions have remained unchanged since Stalin's times. Both were certainly orthodoxy in the international communist movement and the PCF at the beginning of the 1960s. Althusser's schema was in principle quite different. Marx's theoretical revolution comprised a, quote, double foundation in a single break, end quote. Althusser. The birth of two new sciences. Marx founded Marxism. Marxism comprised two autonomous disciplines, a science and a scientific philosophy. Historical materialism was the science of the history of social formations, complete with its theory, its conceptual corpus and object, social formations and their transformation. Dialectical materialism was the science of theoretical practice, with its own concepts, science, ideology, problematic epistemological break, etc., and object, theoretical discourse. As an epistemology, it broke with anterior and contemporary quote, philosophical ideologies, end quote. It was the scientific philosophy. All this Althusser proclaimed, implying a simultaneous break with orthodox conceptions of dialectical materialism as an ontology of matter in movement. Inscribed in Althusser's enterprises from the outset, however, was the very pitfall Althusser was seeking to avoid. Regardless of the sophistication of the Althusserian variant, Marx's philosophy was once again accorded the status of that contradictio in objecto, a scientific philosophy. As the theory of theory and science of science, The theory of theoretical practice is a reprise of the Diamat tradition. Via its weak demarcation criteria, is the theory capable of adjudicating the scientificity of both historical materialism and its competitors, the social and human sciences. Whether it is appropriate for Marxist philosophy to arrogate itself a right Althusser had forbidden classical philosophy is one question. Whether it is capable of making the adjudication is another. At any rate, Diamat, having been shown the front door, climbed back in through an open window. In order to establish the specificity of theoretical practice, Althusser differentiated it from the other practices, as is made apparent in the presentation of the Theory series. Dialectical materialism was at one and the same time a theory of theory and a theory of non-theory, a, quote, theory of practice in general, unquote. Althusser's epistemology was thus supplemented, indeed underpinned by what Kalinikos, following Andrei Glucksmann, terms a, quote, ontology of practices, end quote. Infinitely more original than the Soviet version it may be, but a diluted Diamat it nonetheless is. Nowhere is this better a test than in the unmarked exit Althusser's ontology, provided from his epistemological impasse. Dialectical materialism is, quote, the general theory, the dialectic, in which is theoretically expressed the essence of theoretical practice in general. Through it is the essence of practice in general, and through it the essence of the transformations of the, quote, development, end quote, of things in general, end quote. Dialectical materialism, I don't know why I said dialectical materialism, end quote, Althusser. Footnote, Althusser once proceeds to criticize any, quote, application of the, quote, laws of the dialectic, end quote, to the established sciences, quote, it makes not one iota of difference to their structure or development, ... Worse, it may turn into an ideological fetter, end quote. Althusser. End footnote. Thus, the cognitive appropriation of the real object in and by theoretical practice is made possible by the homology of thought and the real, both of which are practices. As Kalinikos points out, the proximity of this covert solution to Engel's standpoint on the, quote, concordance of thought and being, end quote, in the book Dialectics of Nature is striking. The, quote, the differential nature of scientific discourse, end quote, is assured by its identity with the structure of reality. The non-problematicity of the relation between an object and the knowledge of it, end quote, guaranteed by ontology, the very, quote, empiricism disowned by Althusser secures the theory of theoretical practice against relativism. His epistemology can only perform the task of demarcation allotted on this basis, an uncompelling one, in any case expressly precluded. Now, it was suggested earlier that Althusser's definition of empiricism was of unusual breadth. Now it was suggested earlier that Althusser's definition of empiricism was of unusual breadth, insofar as it encompassed epistemologies which posit an identity between knowledge and the object of which it is knowledge. It would therefore not only include Althusser's own, but also, and crucially, Spinoza's. For if Althusserian insouciance about the objectivity of knowledge had Engelsian precedent, its direct ancestry was Spinoza's, traceable to Spinoza's proposition that, quote, the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things, end quote. Spinoza. Just as for Spinoza, the system of intrinsically true, quote, adequate ideas, end quote, reproduced in thought the order and connection of things. So, for Althusser, objects of knowledge were the concepts of their objects. The order of theoretical practice, thought, quote, expressing, end quote, the order of, quote, practice in general, end quote, and its development, the real, as a consequence of their prior identity. Thus, the theory of theoretical practice's combination via the category of, quote, production, of, quote, the theory of science and of the history of science, end quote, was facilitated by what Paul Patton calls Althusser's, quote, Spinozist absolutism. A rationalist theory of knowledge allowed historical epistemology to dispense with the problematic of the theory of knowledge and assert the, quote, non-problematicity of theory's accordance with reality. One second. I'm sorry. Quote, sorry. Le Recommencement du Materialisme Dialectique, Badiou entitled his commendatory review of the book For Marx and the book Reading Capital in 1967. The theory of theoretical practice was indeed conceived by Althusser as the commencement of Marx's philosophy, and did terminate in a resumption of dialectical materialism in its pretension to be a, quote, theory of practice in general, end quote. Yet if to this extent it constituted a return to the repressed, it was one of indubitable ingenuity, and if in search of what Labica called, quote, introuvable, fuck this, I don't know how to say this. Called l'introuvable philosophie marxiste. Althusser assimilated Spinozist and Bachelardian theses. The result was an epistemology whose singularity, even brilliance within the Marxist tradition, was closely bound up with its shortcomings. Althusser proposed an ontology of practices of which he vouchsafed little or no justification. Yet, however a prioristic his construction, it would in turn be remiss not to recognize and applaud its distance from the dialectical materialism obtained by inversion of Hegel's dialectic. Althusser criticized Lenin and Mao for assuming a, quote, simple original unity, end quote, split into contradictory parts, manifest in the most apparently complex of contradictions that developed thereafter, and restored, albeit enriched, as the end of the process. In place of such Hegelianism, Althusser argued that, quote, Marxism establishes in principle the recognition of the givenness of the complex structure of any concrete, quote, object, a structure which governs both the development of the object and the development of the theoretical practice which produces the knowledge of that object. There is no longer any original essence, only an ever-given pre-givenness, only an ever-pre-givenness, however far knowledge delves into its past. There is no longer any simple unity, only a structured complex unity. There is no longer an original simple unity in any form whatsoever, but instead the ever pre-givenness of a structured complex unity. The ever pre-givenness of a structured complex unity. End quote. Althusser. With Althusser's ontological anti-idealism, pre-givenness, anti-empiricism, structured unity, and anti-historicism, complex unity, as Callinicos has suggested, quote, the concept of difference, of the irreducible heterogeneity of the material world, is domesticated within Marxism, end quote. Althusser's, quote, complex unity was a unity of distinct yet imbricated and articulated practices, irreducible one to another, and not appearances of the essence, whether spiritual, such as absolute spirit, or, quote, material, such as humanity, the proletariat, the economy. The fact that the ontological structure of social reality took this form rendered it opaque, and theory, one of the practices, necessary. The theory that proposed this ontology, the, quote, theory of practice in general, end quote, was, quote, the materialist dialectic, which is none other than dialectical materialism, end quote. The theory that proposed this ontology, the quote, theory of practice in general, end quote, was the quote, materialist dialectic, which is none other than dialectical materialism, end quote. Althusser. Simultaneously, it was an epistemology, the theory of theoretical practice. Like Althusserian ontology, Althusser's epistemology had great virtues. Two were of particular conjunctural significance for Marxism. First and above all, insisted contra Zhdanov and his specters on the autonomy of the veridical from state, class, party, or any other extra scientific interest. Next, it emphasized both the normality and the importance of the sciences, including historical materialism, of continual development, openness to rectification, and the incessant production of new knowledge, became criteria of scientificity. Quote, a science that repeats itself without discovering anything new is a dead science, no longer a science but a fixed dogma. A science only lives in the science's development, that is, from its discoveries, end quote. Thus, the basic thrust of Althusser's philosophical intervention within Marxism was to highlight its incompleteness. What remained to be done? Only the foundations of historical and dialectical materialism had been laid, and the Marxist theoretical practice of the histories of science, ideology, philosophy, and art, among others, had not been exhausted. Indeed, largely remained to be constituted. The theory of theoretical practice possessed other positive features of wider relevance. It amounted to an attempt to incorporate the lessons of modern non-Marxist philosophy of science into Marxism, more specifically to integrate the compelling aspects of the conventionalist critique of empiricism and positivism into a, quote, materialist epistemology. Accordingly, Althusser sought to reconcile the conventionalist insistence on the historical, social, and theoretical character of scientific practice with the realist insistence on the existence of an independent reality irreducible to theory, if knowable via theory, to which theory refers and is obliged indeed to conform in order to count as scientific knowledge. In other words, Althusser sought to integrate historicity, sociality, and scientificity, facticity, and validity, in short, to capture the specificity of science. Thus, the distinction between the object of knowledge and the real object betokened the conjoint commitment to the reality of science, the production and transformation of intra-scientific conceptual objects, and to the reality of its referent, the real extra-scientific world. The notion of epistemological break registered the sui generis nature of science as a counterintuitive cognitive process irreducible to other forms of knowledge. The concept of problematic respected the uniqueness of individual theories as a function of their different conceptual systems, and hence the complexity characteristic of the actual history of the sciences, without sacrificing the possibility of scientific progress to mere scientific change, in principle at least. In principle, for the problem was, of course, that this marriage of conventionalism and materialism to form Althusserian anti-empiricism proved an unequal one, the former assuming dominance and maintaining, moreover, a liaison with rationalism equally injurious to the claims of the latter. In the process of securing the cognitive autonomy of Marxist theory, thereby creating space for its development, the theory of theoretical practice comprised its virtues in a set of serious vices. The, quote, relative autonomy, and, quote, of science ultimately took the form of outright independence of the social formation and its history. Specificity became transcendence, as the epistemological break, which initiated science, sequestered it in the autonomous domain of theoretical practice, where it, quote, escaped the, quote, vicissitudes of non-scientific history. Notwithstanding references to the articulation of theoretical practice with the other social practices, the quote sui generis history of the sciences was disarticulated from them and treated instead as a purely internal epistemological affair of conceptual historicity. Among the costs of this conception, as we shall see, was to be an account of Marxism which quite implausibly severed it in its foundation and development from any socio-historical connections. If science was separated from the social, it was similarly sundered from the empirical. Rationalism and conventionalism converged here to exclude from the latter from scientific practice. Conflating the empirical and the empiricist, Althusser further equated the experiential with the ideological, realm of the imaginary and, quote, false conceptions, antithesis of conceptual science and objective knowledge. These collapses not only debarred any genuine input on the part of empirical evidence into theoretical practice, they ruled out any reference of theoretical constructs back to it for the purposes of evidential control. Falsification in any real sense was precluded. Rectification rendered the merest concessions to fallibilism. Sorry, no, that's disgusting, but I'm sick. Indeed, the plenipotentiary powers granted generality too. The problematic or means of theoretical production over generality 1, its raw material, were such that the status of its products, generalities 3, knowledges, was questionable. Not content with the determination of its own facts and the elaboration of its own theory and object, theoretical practice also supplied its own verification, validating its own results. Althusser introduced his proposition on the, quote, radical inwardness of the criterion of practice, unquote, in the science with the example of mathematical protocols of proof, a symptomatic presence. Mathematics had provided Spinoza's model of science, a, quote, standard of verity, end quote, in the natural and human sciences alike. If Althusser did not seek in positivist fashion to, quote, naturalize the social sciences by compelling their conformity to the procedures of the natural sciences, Althusser did, so to speak, quote, mathematize in rationalist fashion both the natural and the social sciences, projecting onto them the intrinsic method of proof characteristic of an a priori paradigm. The distinction between science and ideology was the, quote, cardinal principle, end quote, of Althusser's epistemology. The upshot for historical materialism, a science, among others, of his account of science as a, quote, detour of theory, end quote, whose itinerary was this detour, was the compromising of both its autonomy and its claims to scientific status. That is, the often remarked unintended consequence of the theory of theoretical practice was an attenuation of scientificity, for it fell short of realism and into conventionalism, a fate from which the rationalist assertion of the adequacy of the theoretical to the real object did not rescue it, only serving on the contrary to subvert the non-dogmatic conception of science essayed by Althusser. The Althusserian demarcation of science from ideology on the basis of their respective counterintuitive/intuitive, open-close, theoretical/practico-social characteristics, however suggestive, fails, neither counterintuitiveness nor openness being peculiar to science. For example, the obvious, quote, materialist, more properly realist criterion, non-correspondence between theoretical constructions and the real objects, was eschewed as empiricist. Although Althusser was, in Thierry Level's words, quote, a realist by fiat, end quote, the real was accorded purely honorific status by Althusser, posited in contradistinction to thought about the real, but thereafter neutralized by being bracketed. No explanation of the appropriation of the non-theoretical real object by the conceptually constructed object of knowledge was offered, effectively divorcing theory from any extra-theoretical reference, thereby undermining the proposition that concept construction was the royal road to science. The failure to establish a plausible relation between theory and the rest of reality
means that conceptual elaboration is via regia, only to more of the same. Theory-dependent knowledge of the real world is transmuted into reality-independent theory. The result, since alchemy, for example, is a theoretical practice second to one in its possession of, quote, definite protocols with which to validate the quality of its product, unquote, or to rationalize its absence. See Chaucer's Canon's Yeoman's Tale. How can we adjudge it a pseudoscience? How can we tell the difference between a chatterbox and a scientist? Althusser's severance of theory from any real referent, reflected in a conception of the history of science as one punctuated by radical discontinuities, provoked an acute form of the problem of commensurability, leaving Althusser ill-placed to reconcile theoretical revolutions and scientific progress. For despite occasional hints at a realist historical perspective, wherein a new problematic referred to the same real object as the problematic which it had superseded, the, quote, reign of new logics, end quote, was the primary Althusserian emphasis in opposition to teleological historiography. Yet how can we even classify, say, historical materialism and classical political economy as competitors, let alone compare their respective demerits, if their objects are internal and their problematics peculiar to them, and there is no arbitration to be held outside their disparate conceptual systems? To conclude, it can be seen that there was a contradiction between Althusser's epistemological project, the provision of a philosophy for science, one, quote, genuinely adequate to constantly developing scientific thought, end quote, and the means by which he attempted to realize it. The effect of his particular assimilation of Spinoza and Bachelard was an unresolved tension between the realism to which he was committed as a Marxist and the relativism or rationalism to which their philosophies led. Oversimplifying, we might say that, having turned to conventionalism to escape the verities of Dialectical, Althusser depended upon rationalism to conjure away relativism, therewith partially returning to Dialectical. He considered Marxism omnipotent because it was true. On his own epistemology, it is impossible to say anything more than that it is true because it is true. If, then, Althusser broke with the vulgar materialism typical of orthodox communist Marxism, Althusser did so at the cost of the sophisticated idealism typical of heterodox Western Marxism, albeit that Althusser's variant is a quite distinct and superior form of it. He is not to be criticized for failing to resolve intractable problems in the philosophy of science, but for claiming to have solved them via a scientific philosophy, when in truth Althusser had either offered unsatisfactory answers or dissolved the very questions. At the same time, all credit is owed to Althusser for being a pioneering initiative in epistemology from within Marxism. Althusser is to be praised for having tabled, and with such determination, problems which communist orthodoxy did not even recognize. His efforts to theorize the specificity of theory yielded an account which, in its novelty and sophistication, it endeavored to avoid positivism without lapsing into a facile, quote, anti-scientism, superseded anything produced hitherto within the orbit of international communism, simultaneously reconnecting Marxist with non-Marxist philosophy of science. To have elaborated the, quote, modernist epistemology he did within the Communist Party of France, West European cheerleader of Lysenkoism, thus helping to liquidate the Cold War heritage, was a major achievement, once whose audacity should not be forgotten. A decade after the publication of the books For Marx and Reading Capital, Althusser meditated on the significance of the distinction between the object of knowledge and the real object. It had been motivated by the wish to dramatize the enormous theoretical labor involved in Marx's foundation of historical materialism, to highlight the break with bourgeois common sense indispensable to a scientific theory of history, and to turn Marx's, quote, truth into a living and active truth for us, end quote. Althusser. However worthy the ambition, the question must be posed. Did Althusser's epistemological theses facilitate a restoration of, or in their turn deform, Marx's, quote, unprecedented break, unquote, and the theory that resulted? For the second, quote, cardinal principle, end quote, from which Althusser started, one derivative from his division of the world into the realms of the imaginary and the true, was that, left to its own devices, the proletariat was incapable of generating, quote, the science of society, and hence the science of its own practice, but only utopian or reformist ideologies of society. Marxism had been produced and developed outside the working class by the counterintuitive theoretical practice of intellectuals, Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and then, quote, imported, end quote, into it. In line with this venerable Kautskyist and Leninist thesis, Althusser argued that the relationship of Marxist theory to the proletariat and its practice was one of exteriority. In line with this venerable Kautskyist and Leninist thesis, Althusser argued that the relationship of Marxist theory to the proletariat and its practice is one of exteriority. Without Marxist philosophy, there could be no Marxist science. Without Marxist science, no scientific socialism. Whether in his unilateral emphasis on Lenin's dictum of 1902 to the exclusion of an equally pertinent axiom of 1920, Althusser compromised the novelty of historical materialism even as he strove to rearticulate historical materialism, is one of the questions to which we must now turn. Footnote. It looks like this is a reference to the pertinent axiom, something Lenin said in 1920. Quote, correct revolutionary theory, ... assumes final shape only in close connection with the practical activity of a truly mass and truly revolutionary movement, end quote. Lenin.